Coming up with character names can be such a puzzle, especially lead series ones. We love it when authors on the show pull the curtain back for us. Would you do so with Mary Russell?
She literally walked onto the page. What you see on the first page of The Beekeeper's Apprentice. I was 15 when I first met Sherlock Holmes. 15 years old with my nose in a book as I walked the Sussex Downs and nearly stepped on him. That was the first sentence I wrote down. And unlike most of my books, that sentence didn't particularly change. I think I changed a word and changed it back, added a comma and took it away. So it has such a strong flavor of a person. Someone who has no doubt, who has a slight sense of humor, is aware of the absurdity of the situation, and goes on. That I didn't really need to do anything except find out what, who, and where she was. So that was the beginning. As for her name, it's kind of a long and complicated story, but basically I had a couple of books on my shelf based on the feminist theology that I'd been studying it as a grad student. One of them was a woman named Letty Russell, and the other one was Rosemary Rother. So I took the Mary from the one and the Russell from the other, and it seemed to work. Sometimes I name characters and I don't. It has corners I don't like to it with the name. Either it looks funny on the page, it sounds funny in the mouth, but with that one, it seemed to work.
Talk a bit, if you would, about the research curve you took into the writing of the now legendary The Beekeeper's Apprentice, both into the Sherlock Holmes history and how you wanted to adapt it to Mary Russell's own original perspective as both a person and investigator.
I think people generally assume that I was a great committed Sherlockian before I started them and just wanted to write about Sherlock Holmes. And no.
Nothing.
I think that the Granada television series with Jeremy Brett must have been regularly playing. I'm not sure what was playing in September or the summer of 1987, but whatever it was, I'd been watching it. And so the character was on my mind in a way that it normally wouldn't have been, because I hadn't read the stories since whatever it is you read in high school, The Speckled Band. And so it occurred to me that this man Holmes gets so much credit for being brilliant, when if a woman were to do it, people would sort of dismissively say, "Oh, women's intuition." And I thought, wait a minute, why does Holmes get credit for figuring stuff out when, any woman says, "Yeah, I see this, I see that, I see the third thing," and people would say, "Better." So I thought, I will put him in front of a young woman who has that specifically Sherlockian mind, but who is also a female feminist, 20th century, and has a dimension to her that he doesn't, namely an interest in religion and theology. And so that's where, that's where they came from, that she is based on him, but has definitely her own take to the world. The only problem with that is that I knew nothing about Sherlock Holmes. So I then had to go out the next day and buy the collected works in one of those very, very tiny mass market collections and read my way through them, which is an interesting way of coming at a classical figure like Holmes, because you have a picture of who he is and how he functions, even if you haven't read the stories. But you tend to think of him as a thinking machine who doesn't have a lot of heart. And I found that very much not so in the stories. his entire reason for being is a passion to fight evil, to set things right. He also has an unexpectedly whimsical sense of humor that I'm not sure most Americans catch because it's very British.
When you arrive at A Monstrous Regiment of Women and A Letter to Mary, the second and third volumes in the series, which both became incredibly successful books, can you share a bit with fans about what the early stories that helped flesh out the foundational elements of the series were within these books?
The the order of books that I wrote is not the order of books that were published. The first book that I wrote all the way through was The Beekeeper's Apprentice. I had started a book, I don't know, 5 years earlier, that was later published as a sci-fi, Califia's Daughters. But I got halfway through it and I didn't know how to finish telling it, and so I put it aside. So the first book that I wrote, beginning to end, as a novel was The Beekeeper's Apprentice. The second book I wrote was A Letter of Mary, which became the third one, and it fit a pattern that I had. I don't tend to write that way as much now, but I used to write it. It was very common for me. I would be writing in a book and I wouldn't quite know what came next. So I would skip over a section and start writing a new chapter where the story needed to be when it got there. And I would then go back when I saw what was going on and what I needed to do in the interim. I would go back and write that section. So this is kind of like that, except entire books. So the first one sets everything up. The third one, the one that I wrote second, looks at the two of them as a partnership. They are married. They have been married for 3 years. You plunk right down into them in Sussex, and this is what their relationship looks like and will continue to look like. And so once I had written that, I could then look at the one in the middle. How'd they get there? How'd they get from she's a 19-year-old apprentice, injured in their final case. They're setting off. There's obviously a future, but she, he, and we don't know what it is. And how do we get from that state to the state where they are happily married? I mean, they're interestingly married, certainly. And life is going in a definite direction. So I figured you needed to start with, she has to come of age. So it starts when she's about to turn 21. And they need to decide what their relationship is. And that's the story of the book. She gets involved with a women's community. There are many appealing things about it that do not involve him. On the other hand, there's a lot about living with him that is vastly appealing. And she has to make that decision, and he has to make the decision as well. So it's interesting because the book that I just finished, it's just gone into production now. There's a brief reflection by Holmes, looking back at that period where in Monstrous Regiment, for some reason, Russell imagines that the two of them can just kind of step into a partnership and pretend everything is fine. And yet it's Holmes who says, we can't do that because it would destroy us both. So how Holmes, of all people, has more emotional intelligence than this young woman is interesting, but it seems to fit my concept of the two characters. So anyway, that's just something that it's about a paragraph in the current book that'll be out this summer. So
In bringing a classic Holmes case of the Hounds of Baskerville back into vogue in the Moor, how artful a walk was that for you on the page, balancing the old with the new?
I'm always working around Holmesian um, adventures and characteristics and quirks. But to take one that is specifically built around Holmes' story, it did take some doing, because it was, what I needed the story to do and what raw material I was given by Conan Doyle didn't always go hand in hand. So there's a couple places where I sort of nudge things to the side, but nothing too violent, I think. But yeah, it's great fun to think of a way of telling a story that is around another story.